Ukraine is one of the main reasons the G7 leaders are meeting this week in Evian, France. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was invited to attend special sessions with the G7 leaders. Why Ukraine is a major focus. The leaders are discussing additional sanctions on Russia, military and financial aid for Ukraine, whether there is any realistic path to peace negotiations, long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, Ukraine's ongoing effort to join the European Union. UK position. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced support for further sanctions aimed at reducing Russian revenue and pledged additional energy assistance to Ukraine. France's goal. French President Emmanuel Macron is trying to keep the G7 united behind Ukraine while also pushing for eventual negotiations involving Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the United States. The Trump factor. One of the biggest stories at the summit is whether U.S. President Donald Trump will continue strong support for Ukraine. Several European leaders are reportedly trying to convince him to maintain pressure on Russia, not ease support for Kyiv. What to watch? The biggest headline that could come out of the summit would be 1. New sanctions on Russia. 2. A major new aid package for Ukraine. 3. Any sign of direct peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. 4. A Trump-Zelensky breakthrough meeting. At the moment, Ukraine remains one of the top agenda items, although the recent U.S.-Iran developments are competing for attention. G7 is that pressure on Russia should be increased, not reduced. Prime Minister Keir Starmer arrived at the summit announcing a new sanctions package and additional support for Ukraine. What sanctions did the UK announce? The UK says it is imposing sanctions on about 70 entities linked to Russia's war effort. Financial institutions and networks accused of helping Russia bypass existing sanctions. Military procurement networks that obtain Western technology for Russia. Additional vessels in Russia's so-called shadow fleet used to transport oil and LNG outside normal sanctions enforcement. What is the shadow fleet? The shadow fleet is a network of aging tankers, often using complex ownership structures, that helps Russia continue exporting oil despite Western sanctions. The UK has made disrupting this fleet one of its main objectives. Ukraine support. Alongside sanctions, Britain announced a £210 million energy package for Ukraine, including nuclear fuel support intended to help Ukraine's energy system through future winters. What is Starmer trying to achieve at the G7? Starmer is urging other G7 countries to 1. Maintain military and economic support for Ukraine. 2. Tighten sanctions enforcement. 3. Make it harder for Russia to earn revenue from oil exports. 4. Keep diplomatic pressure on Moscow while supporting any credible peace process. Why this matters. One of the biggest debates at the summit is whether the G7 can stay united on Russia. European leaders want continued pressure on Moscow, while much attention is focused on how strongly the United States will continue supporting Ukraine. In short, the UK's current position is more sanctions, more pressure on Russia's oil revenues, and continued support for Ukraine. His goal at the G7 is broader than just Ukraine. As host, President Emmanuel Macron is trying to keep the Western allies united on several major crises at once. On Ukraine, France wants continued support for Ukraine, the US to remain engaged in the conflict rather than shifting attention elsewhere. Any future peace talks to include Ukraine and European countries, not just Washington and Moscow. On Iran, Macron is also focused on the new US-Iran agreement. France wants a stronger final deal that addresses nuclear concerns and regional security while keeping the Strait of Hormuz open for global shipping. On the G7 itself, one of Macron's biggest goals is simply to keep the G7 united, despite disagreements between Europe and the United States. He has repeatedly said the summit should find common solutions to global tensions and avoid fragmentation among allies. On the economy and AI, France also placed artificial intelligence regulation, economic growth, global trade imbalances on the summit agenda. Reading between the lines, many analysts see Macron's main objective as 1. Keeping Trump engaged with allies. 2. Keeping support for Ukraine from weakening. 3. Positioning France as a diplomatic mediator between the US, Europe, Ukraine, and Middle Eastern partners. So if you boil it down to one sentence, France wants to preserve Western unity while pushing for a negotiated path on Ukraine and stability in the Middle East. The approach at the G7 appears to be focused on ending the Ukraine war through negotiations rather than increasing military pressure on Russia. European leaders are trying to persuade him to take a tougher stance on Moscow, but Trump's emphasis remains on reaching a deal. What Trump wants. Based on statements around the summit, a negotiated end to the war, direct engagement with both Ukraine and Russia, a diplomatic breakthrough similar to what he claims to have achieved with the recent Iran agreement, reduced focus on an open-ended conflict and more focus on a settlement. On Russia, Trump has recently spoken with both President Vladimir Putin and President Volodymyr Zelensky and said he sees a possible opportunity for progress because both leaders appear willing to talk. On Ukraine, Trump is participating in a G7 working session that includes Zelensky, but reports indicate there is no formal one-on-one bilateral meeting scheduled at this time. Why Europe is concerned. France, the UK, Germany, and other allies worry that Trump's preferred peace terms could involve concessions that Ukraine finds difficult to accept. They are pushing him to maintain sanctions pressure and military support while negotiations occur. The key question, the biggest unknown at this G7, is whether Trump, 1. supports additional sanctions on Russia, 2. continues military aid at current levels, 3. pushes aggressively for immediate peace talks, 4. or proposes a new US-led peace framework. In one sentence, Europe's goal is support Ukraine first, then negotiate. Trump's goal appears closer to negotiate first, then end the war. Europe is not completely unified on every detail, but on the big picture there is broad agreement among most EU governments. Germany. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has been among the strongest advocates for continued support to Ukraine. Germany supports continued military aid, continued sanctions on Russia, increased European defense spending, negotiations only if Ukraine is directly involved. Poland. Poland is one of the most hawkish countries regarding Russia. Strong military support for Ukraine, strong sanctions, deep skepticism toward any deal seen as rewarding Russian territorial gains. Baltic states. The governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are among the strongest supporters of Ukraine. They view Russia as a direct long-term security threat. They generally favor maintaining maximum pressure on Moscow. France, as discussed earlier, France supports Ukraine but also wants to keep diplomatic channels open and eventually reach a negotiated settlement involving Ukraine and its allies. Italy, Giorgia Meloni has generally supported Ukraine and sanctions, while also emphasizing economic stability and avoiding escalation. Hungary. The outlier remains Viktor Orban. Hungary has repeatedly criticized some sanctions. It favors a faster peace settlement. It often argues Europe should focus more on negotiations. Overall European position. Most European governments currently support 1. continued support for Ukraine, 2. continued sanctions on Russia, 3. increasing Europe's own defense capabilities, 4. peace negotiations only with Ukraine's participation. The real strategic shift. What's changed since the early years of the war is that Europe is increasingly preparing for the possibility that future US support could become less predictable. That has led to greater emphasis on European defense cooperation, weapons production, and strategic independence. So if you put Europe on a spectrum, most hawkish, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Mainstream position, Germany, France, UK, Netherlands, Nordic countries. Most negotiation-focused, Hungary, and a few smaller political movements elsewhere in Europe. The biggest debate at the G7 is not whether Europe supports Ukraine, it largely does, but how long that support can be sustained and what a future peace settlement might look like. UK's goals have remained fairly consistent, although the exact negotiating position can shift depending on battlefield and diplomatic developments. What Ukraine says it wants. 1. Security and survival. Ukraine's first priority is ensuring it can remain a sovereign, independent state and prevent future attacks. 2. Russian withdrawal. Ukraine has long called for Russia to withdraw from Ukrainian territory that Ukraine considers occupied, including areas seized since 2014 and during the full-scale invasion. 3. Security guarantees. Ukraine wants strong security guarantees from allies so that any ceasefire or peace agreement cannot simply be followed by another invasion a few years later. 4. Return of prisoners and deportees. Ukraine has repeatedly demanded the return of prisoners of war and Ukrainian civilians, including children whom Kyiv says were taken to Russia or Russian-controlled areas. 5. Reconstruction. Ukraine seeks financial support and compensation for rebuilding infrastructure, homes, energy systems, and businesses damaged during the war. The difficult part: peace talks. The biggest challenge is that Ukraine's publicly stated goals and Russia's publicly stated goals remain far apart. Ukraine generally argues peace should not require surrendering territory. Ukraine must be involved directly in any negotiations. Security guarantees must be credible and enforceable. Russia has often maintained different positions regarding territory, neutrality, and future security arrangements. Zelensky's position. Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly said that Ukraine wants peace, but not a settlement that leaves the country vulnerable to future attacks or forces it to give up its right to determine its own future. Why this matters at the G7. The main question facing G7 leaders is not whether Ukraine wants peace. Virtually everyone says they do. The disagreement is over. What conditions are acceptable for a peace deal? Whether territory becomes part of negotiations? What security guarantees would be provided afterward? How much pressure should be applied to Russia versus how quickly negotiations should begin? That is why there is tension between the European approach, support Ukraine while strengthening its position, and the Trump administration's emphasis on accelerating negotiations. Both sides say they want peace, but they differ on how to get there. Russia's publicly stated goals have also remained broadly consistent, though the wording and emphasis have changed over time. What Russia says it wants. 1. Recognition of territorial gains. Russia has sought recognition of territories it claims as part of Russia. This is one of the biggest disagreements with Ukraine. Ukrainian neutrality. Russia has repeatedly argued that Ukraine should not become a member of NATO and should maintain a neutral military status. 3. Security guarantees for Russia. Moscow says it wants security arrangements that address what it describes as threats near its borders. 4. Sanctions relief. Russia has consistently called for the removal or reduction of Western sanctions. 5. Protection of Russian-speaking populations. Russian officials frequently cite the protection of Russian-speaking communities as one of their objectives. Where the positions clash: Ukraine, Russia. Restore territorial integrity. Recognition of Russian territorial claims. Security guarantees from allies. Limits on Ukraine's military alignment. Continued Western support. Removal of Western sanctions. Ukraine chooses its future alliances. Restrictions on NATO expansion. Why a deal is difficult. The fundamental issue is that both sides want outcomes that directly conflict with each other on territory, security arrangements, and sanctions. What Russia is looking for at the G7. Russia is not a G7 member, but Moscow is watching closely for signs that Western unity is weakening, disagreements between Europe and the United States, any movement toward negotiations, any reduction in military or economic support for Ukraine. The core divide in one sentence. Ukraine's ideal outcome is security, sovereignty, and restoration of territory. Russia's ideal outcome is security guarantees, limits on Ukraine's military alignment, sanctions relief, and acceptance of at least some Russian territorial gains. That gap is why, despite increasing discussion of peace talks in 2026, a final settlement remains difficult to achieve. And that's an important piece of context when discussing what each side wants. According to multiple reports today, Ukraine launched another large drone attack against Russian energy infrastructure. Russian authorities reported drones over Moscow, and videos and reports showed a fire at the Moscow oil refinery in the Kapotnia district. This matters because, while G7 leaders are discussing peace and negotiations, the war itself is still very active. Ukraine continues to target Russian oil facilities because oil revenue helps fund Russia's war effort. Russia continues to launch missile and drone strikes against targets inside Ukraine. Both sides are trying to improve their position before any potential negotiations. Why oil refineries? Ukraine has increasingly focused on oil refineries, fuel depots, pipelines, export terminals. The goal is to reduce fuel supplies and economic revenue connected to Russia's war effort. Recent reports indicate these attacks have contributed to fuel shortages and operational disruptions at several Russian refineries. How does this affect peace talks? This is why peace negotiations remain difficult. Ukraine's position: continue fighting while increasing pressure on Russia. Use long-range drone strikes to weaken Russian logistics and revenue. Negotiate from a position of strength. Russia's position: continue military operations while seeking terms favorable to Moscow. Resist pressure from sanctions and infrastructure attacks. Negotiate from a position of strength. In other words, both sides say they want peace, but both are still actively trying to improve their leverage on the battlefield before agreeing to any final deal. Today's reported refinery strike near Moscow is a good example of that dynamic. And from a G7 perspective, it makes the summit's central question even harder. Open quote. Can a peace process begin while both sides are still escalating attacks on each other's critical infrastructure? Close quote.
Outcome: keep it civil. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more updates, news, and discussions. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, but please keep the conversation respectful and constructive. Thanks for watching.